Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to class this afternoon. Thank you for joining me, whether you're watching live or you're watching the recording. I appreciate you watching. There's a little glitch where Blackboard went down for maybe 10 to 15 minutes. A little bit earlier. If you weren't on in that window, you probably didn't even notice it, but it's back available again now. So it's really a non-issue. Not even sure why I mention it. I guess just to keep you informed. We are continuing on, and we're working in Module 1 today. And remember that, a couple things to remember as we kind of go through what we're talking about today. I kind of modeled this class more in line with the university class, right? Because one of the things that I do with this class is, there's a lot of theory that goes into it. We do a lot of practice in other classes. Right, Web 115, Web 215, Web 140, we do a lot of practice, a lot of hands-on, a lot of making things. And then we get to this class and we have this fundamental understanding that we're doing these things without this background of why we do things. So when we work in the design class, one of the things that I try to do is I try to really focus this as a design class so that we are talking about making decisions that are deliberate. Right? We're making deliberate decisions in terms of what we're designing, in terms of what we're making and putting on the web. So it's more than just what you think looks good, or any of that. Right, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start this out today by defining design. When we're defining design, we have a working definition of what design is in this course. And our working definition of design is the following. Design is solving problems within constraints. Right, so what we see here is two things. This is twofold. Right? First thing that we're talking about is we're talking about solving problems. We're talking about solving problems. Because at its core, design is about solving problems. There's a problem, and we have to figure out a solution, right? There is, and this is something that we'll talk more about as we go along, there are different types of gaps in our understanding of how things work, and our understanding of how things should work. Right, and basically all of these gaps separate where we're at in our problem state to where we want to be going in our goal state. And so the way that we choose to bridge this gap and the effort that we put into place to make sure that we can get from point A to point B here is our design, right? It is the point where we are solving these problems. But then there's this other little half to this. Solving problems within constraints. What is a constraint? We get deeper into what a constraint is later on in the semester. But when we're thinking about the idea of a constraint is simply a factor that inhibits you. Right? And these factors could be internal factors. Right? They could be things about you personally that inhibit you. You know, you might lack the knowledge to be able to do a certain thing. You might not have the experience to be able to tackle something completely, to be able to fully understand a problem. Right, but they could also be external factors. Things like budget. Right, budget's a big deal. Because if somebody comes in and they tell you, okay, I've got a budget of $500 for this project, and you end up having to put a ton of time into it, 100 hours of time into it. I mean, in that case, you're only netting $5 an hour. You put way more time in it than the budget really should have allowed for. And this really kind of gets, the budget question there really gets to one of the interesting things that we talk about in terms of web design and web development, because it was one of the hardest conversations that I would have with when I was doing web design all the time. One of the hardest conversations that I would have with somebody else is the conversation around how much it would cost. Because I wouldn't, and you'd find that a lot of other freelance web designers / developers wouldn't give a price. My general response to that would be, well, what is your budget? Because budget is a constraint. And so I can design you a $500 website, or I can design you a $5,000 website, or a $50,000 website. The only difference is how I'm building this bridge. I might be able to make that bridge out of paper. I might be able to make that bridge out of wood. I might be able to make that bridge out of steel. All of those things solve the problems, but some of them solve them better than others, and might have a more long-term effect. So these constraints matter. Who your users are matter. That's going to be a ton of what we talk about this semester. Just determining who these users are, what their needs are. Because that's part of this, right? That goes into this goal, this problem state and this goal state. And so the first thing that we kind of have to get in the open is the fact that design isn't really just about making things look good, right? Making things look good is a very small part of design. Granted, right, making things look good help, right? And it helps in this process. It helps to do things to bridge the gap between our problem state and our goal state. But it's not the only thing, right? Like, there are some problems that something looking good helps, right? This idea of, time retention, time on page, right? If you're on an aesthetically pleasing site, you're more likely to stay on that site to accomplish the task that you need to accomplish. If you're on an aesthetically pleasing site, you're more likely to trust that site, which is something that we talk about toward the end of the semester when we get to ethics. Right, but you've seen it before, a poorly designed website, a website that looks kind of ugly. You feel a little more sketched out by it than a website that looks professional and nice and, looks like time was put into it. Right, so there are problems that we can solve with something looking good, but simply looking good is not the be-all and end-all that's going to solve all of our problems. And so that's where the course comes in. Right, so we have to determine, one, how to discover these problems. Two, how to get to the root of these problems. And then we can get into solving the problems. Right, and so throughout the semester, one of the big things that we do is we kind of cover this design process. And what you'll find early on, right, I've been in the middle of this year-long process with a major web development firm. And, like I mentioned in the last live session, it's been very good for me because it mimics kind of what I teach in this class, their process. And so we've been looking at nearly a year-long session here for them. They're in the stages now where they're kind of wrapping up. They started it around this time last year, but they're kind of wrapping up now, doing quality assurance testing and things of that nature. We look forward to debuting the new site probably in the spring, at the very latest by next fall. Right, that requires things on our end. So there's a new Cleveland Community College website coming very, very soon. But it was probably 2 to 3 months before a single wireframe was ever drawn up, before a single sketch was ever made, before a single line of code was ever written. Because that first few months there revolved completely around determining the problems, figuring out who the stakeholders are, figuring out what the stakeholders need, and trying to come up with solutions that we could implement to solve these problems. So at the core of design, our working definition of design is this idea that we are solving problems within constraints. And it's a big one, right? And so, extending from that, I'd like to talk about the concept of user experience design. UX design. Right? And so this is a concept that, is our basic focus. We're focusing on the user experience. We are user-centered designers. So when you see user experience or UX, the most important thing about the websites that we build is the user, right? That's why we build the site. I'm not building a site for me. I'm building a site for other people to use it. And that's the big thing that we kind of have to work through our heads as we're getting started. Right, is the idea that whether or not I personally like something is almost irrelevant. Right, the bigger deal is how our user receives the experience that we've built for them. So when we're talking about UX, when we're talking about user experience design, the user is at the center. And we want to make sure that the user has the best possible experience when using our websites. Now, there is some terminology we need to clear up before we get started here. The first one is the concept of UI. You might see these two acronyms here paired together, UX, UI. And UI stands for user interface. And so some people will use these interchangeably. These are typically people who maybe don't really know what they are talking about, because the UI is a specific part of the user experience, right? The interface that I have with the website is part of the experience, but it's not the whole thing. It's a good chunk of it. And the UI in general is a little bit easier to design. The overall user experience is difficult, right? And what makes that difficult is the fact that, our UI, it's tangible. Right, it's something that we can look at and that we can experience, and we can see whether we've made a difficult UI for people to navigate or an easy UI for people to navigate. And we can give it to a few people. We can see if orders go up. We can try this and that, try several things there. And we can see if a UI is working, and we can tweak it if it's not. Right, but how do we craft an experience? How do we craft an experience? What is an experience? An experience is something that, you have internally. Right? You're either having a good time or you're having a bad time. Right? What happens in you having an experience is really happening in your mind. Right? Because you could give two different people the same set of circumstances, and those two different people experience those circumstances in a completely separate way. Right? Because the way they deal with these circumstances, what they have experienced in the past as a frame of reference is very different. Right? So two people could encounter the same thing and have a different experience because the experience is going on not in the world, but in their minds. And so when we come up with this idea of, we're talking about user experience design. We're talking about designing somebody else's experience. But we're designing something that occurs in a place that we can't touch, in a place that we can't access. How do we do that? How do we design someone else's experience? And the idea here is that we want to think like a magician. And so if we were in a seated class together, this is where I would normally show you the Penn and Teller video that I have in the module. Right, I have that nice little UX is like magic learning object in there that has the Penn and Teller video in it. I want you all to make sure that you watch that. Right, because in this video, Penn and Teller, do one of the things that they have done from time to time because it makes magic really even more impressive once you see it from the other side, so you can really see how skilled somebody is when they're pulling off this sleight of hand expertly. Right? They go through a little scenario where they are having Teller perform a seemingly mundane activity, right? He walks out on stage with a cigarette. He throws it on the ground. He stamps it out. He opens a pack. He gets another cigarette out, puts it in, and lights it. Right, a seemingly mundane task that you've probably seen people just, around town perform all the time. Right? You might even be a smoker yourself when you've done something like that. But when you watch it from the other side, you notice that it's not what it seems. That nothing that you thought happened was real. Something happened on that stage, and there's a reality to what happened on that stage. But what was communicated through the air to your mind was completely separate than what actually happened. And that's where we kind of get into this idea of UX and crafting experience. Right? Because once you go on, I don't want to spoil, I don't want to say what was actually going on. I want you all to watch that video. I think the whole idea here behind this is actually really summed up very well from another quote from a famous magician, Peter Samuelson, who said, "I can't do magic. I can only help you see it." Any magician you've ever seen, whether it's, Penn and Teller or Peter Samuelson or Chris Angel or David Copperfield, they're not wizards. Right? They're performing sleight of hand. They're performing illusions. They are, they're not casting real spells. But it seems like they're casting real spells because of how well crafted they've made the experience of their magic show. Right? That's the mic drop right there. Right? And that's where we tie this all back into web design. Right? What's going on at a magic show is not wizardry. It's a well-crafted experience that creates magic, not on stage, but in the mind of the user, in the mind of the viewer. Right, so when we're designing something well, we're not doing anything incredibly special. We're making things in the way that we can make them. We're solving problems within constraints. We're doing what we know how to do. And we're crafting it in such a way that it's creating a good experience in the mind of our user. Right, when we see this Venn diagram here, right, we have our magician on one side, our audience on the other side, and the magic happens in the middle. Right, the audience is involved in the actual magic occurring because it's occurring in their minds. When we reframe this and look at it from a design perspective, our Venn diagram here looks exactly the same. Our Venn diagram has good design occurring in the mind of the user. That's where that user experience is formed. So we cannot create an experience directly. But what we can do is create an environment in which a good experience is possible. We can craft an environment in which a good experience is possible. And we can take these things from magicians, some sleight of hand techniques, to be able to help us do that. Right? For example, let's check this out. Let me get that full screen there so we can see this a little better when we get it. Oh, no, wait, that was it. I'm talking about a loading wheel or a loading bar, right? You've seen these. So what's happening when we see one of these loading bars? Did I get you right? I tried to get you. I tried to create this experience where, like, oh, they're going to think something's loading. But nothing's actually loading. I'm just trying to show them a picture of the loading bar. I tried. Right, but these loading bars, these loading wheels, these are a big thing that we use that's a sleight of hand. Right? Because imagine what you would think, right? And you might have encountered stuff like this before. Imagine what you'd think if you went up, you filled out a form, you clicked the submit button, and just nothing happened. Just nothing happened. What do you think? Maybe your first inclination might be to, hey, press that button 100 more times. Right? Submit that form 100 more times. And on the back end, they get 100 different form submissions from you because they didn't do their job on the front end and gave any sort of affordance or signifier that work is happening. right? When we replace that with a loading wheel while the work is happening, then we're communicating that to our user. We're saying, hey, don't worry. It's taking a second. Work is happening. So we'll let you know when it's done. Right? We're not always able to do things immediately. Sometimes we are and sometimes we're not, right? But we don't have to be able to do something immediately if we can do a little bit of misdirection while we're working in the background. If we can basically work when your audience is distracted. Another example of this would be there's a little button in Gmail when you send a mail. Like immediately after sending the mail, there's a button there to like undo the send at the top of your screen. This undo send feature is not an actual feature. Right? The way this, normally the path of an email, you send it and it goes out immediately and it's in somebody else's inbox immediately. And once an email is in somebody's inbox, you can't go back and take it out, right? I mean, you can if you're all on the same email system, like you can recall messages and stuff like that. That's a separate thing. Right? But, if you're using Gmail and you're sending it to another person, you can't go back into that person's email box and take it out and unsend that message. You can't unring a bell. Right? So, but there's this undo send button that pops up for just a brief amount of time after you've sent a Gmail. This is a flaw masquerading as a feature. They're putting a mask on this as a feature to distract you from the flaw. Right? Because your email, let me back up, Gmail's massive. Right? And there are tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of emails being sent through Gmail all the time. Right? And even as massive as Google's server networks and such are, to be able to handle that much traffic, you got to take a little bit of time. You got to have a little bit of a queue. You got to do some other things to kind of prevent spamming and all this kind of stuff. Right? So they're just like, oh, hey, like, since we put this in a queue and we wait for a few seconds before we actually push this email through our network, what if we gave the user the opportunity to just take it out of the queue before it's sent? Right? You can't undo a send after it's in somebody's inbox, but you can before it's left. Right? Like, it's kind of like mail, right? Like, if you put a piece of mail in your mailbox, before the postman comes to get it, you can think, maybe I shouldn't have sent that. Go back out, retrieve it, bring it back in the house. But when the postman comes by and picks it up, that's gone. There's no getting it at that point. Right? And the Gmail works like that. It's sitting in your mailbox until the postman comes by and picks it up. So while you're distracted by that, it's giving you a feature that's not really a feature. And so what we end up here is this idea that, and with these classes, I will say, I kind of like to treat these particular classes like workshops. Right? So instead of having a through line where we're constantly discussing similar things, we'll be discussing different things from week to week. And sometimes we'll discuss one thing and sometimes we'll discuss another. And I like to kind of consider them all as just individual workshops that are going to support what we're doing in the module as we work to improve our knowledge of web design. And one of the things that I like to do in each of these is I like to leave you all with kind of a final thought to think about over the course of the next week before next week's live class. And that final thought is this. And it's from Arthur C. Clarke. And it's the idea that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. I mean, you can think about it in terms of maybe some stories that you've heard before. There are various tales, of it's various stories and movies and books that people have written about someone from the present who has time traveled to the past. And they had modern technologies with them. And if you travel back far enough to somebody who fire was a luxury and difficult to make, and you pull out a lighter and you light it up, it looks like you made fire with your hands. But you didn't. You were using technology. When you build a good website, and people have a good experience on it, they might think, wow, there's some real techno wizardry behind this. There's not. You just put a lot of best practices into place. All we really need to know how to do is HTML, CSS, maybe a little bit of JavaScript from time to time. And we can design a good website. So any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. If we do things the right way, which is basically the purpose of this course, right? Getting us to doing things the right way, taking the right things into consider as we're building that gap between our problem state and our goal state, as we are solving problems within constraints. Then we'll have done magic. Because with this as well, I can say that you don't always notice good design. But you always notice bad design. This first one's always a little bit short. It is accompanied with the boot camp module for this course, which I'm not going to demonstrate for you because I wanted to do this material. But I will be providing you all with some of my old boot camp module sites that I've built for other classes that you can have a look at there for support with that if you need it. Don't forget to work through each folder as you get to it. Complete everything that's in the folder, and then complete the stuff that's at the module level. We'll hang out in the chat for a couple minutes in case anybody who's here with me live has any questions. Whoops, I forgot to close the eye on that one. Let me close that. Okay. But that's all that I have for you for today. Right, a bit on the shorter side as we get started here. It'll get we'll pick up speed as we progress. But we'll hang out in the chat for a minute just in case anybody who's live has any questions. If you're watching the recording and you have any questions, please let me know. Send me an email, send me a Teams message, whatever you want to do. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.